let's go ahead and get started just to be mindful of everybody's time. And then as folks join us, they'll be able to catch up. So welcome to xAPI Data Strategy and Design with the End in Mind. I am Ann Wynn, the risk marketing person. And this morning we will have the session facilitated and hosted by Art Working Team. I promised I know how to pronounce his name. I've worked with him a number of years, and Duncan Welder. Art is the CEO of Risk Inc. And as an early xAPI enthusiast, Art led Risk to be the first to implement xAPI 1.0 in a commercial LMS, our very own VTA. And since 2012, he's been an active participant on the ADL CMI 5 committee. Art frequently presents and authors blog articles on xAPI and CMI5 and is considered to be among the industry's leading experts on both specifications. Duncan is our Director of Client Services here at Risk. He is also an xAPI evangelist, advocate, and enthusiast. He frequently speaks at industry conferences on xAPI and its capabilities, including the Learning Guild's DevLearn and Torrance Learning's xAPI cohort. So welcome to everyone. Take it away, gentlemen.
All right, thank you, Ann. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone making the time to join us today. What we're going to do is talk about data strategy and really designing your xAPI with the end in mind, right? We want to have a destination for where we are headed. And we're going to share some case studies. We're going to share one pretty decent failure that we had and how we recovered from that. And would love to have calls or questions come through at any time, like Ann said in the chat there. Contact information for Art and I, we are super easy to find, both here at Risk's Houston headquarters on the south side of town, and regularly online, Twitter, LinkedIn, easy to connect with. So never hesitate to reach out there. We are, geeks that like to talk about learning specifications. So one of the things that Art said when we first started getting into, the old shootout days of xAPI, right, where they were trying to see what could be done. Art was excited about it. We were all excited about it. Clearly, we've been dedicated to this now for quite a number of years. But when Art came and said the nice thing about xAPI is I can track everything, and then the thing he said immediately after was the worst thing about xAPI is I can track just about everything. So you really do have to make a determination on what you want to track and how you're going to do that. Back in the very early days, we said, we'll just catch everything, right? So if we could grab that data, we did. But everything is not a data strategy. You have trouble beginning to identify, the trees for the forest when you just grab everything. Plus, it leads to less consistent data because I'm willing to accept essentially anything. It's hard to analyze, partly because it's inconsistent. Second, because you can't just dump data in a bucket and expect to see a magical trend out. So one of the things that we did run into with another company, friends of ours, that they had started really collecting everything that they possibly could, and they brought their learning record store down pretty quickly there. So you have to at least think about what that capacity is going to be, because if you just gather everything, it's really a prescription for failure. You're not going to be able to identify or document what you're trying to find out by putting xAPI inside your content. So, Art?
So we believe that everything is not a good data strategy. It's just a bad idea. You in the mortal words of Queen, you want it all. But you have to think about, with capturing that much data, how are you going to query it? To be very frank, the query capabilities built into the specification of xAPI spec for querying are fairly poor. You can't always query exactly what you want. You may have to get a lot of data that you didn't want and then filter through it. So that's something you want to minimize if you possibly can with a good data strategy. And then after you've done that, you finally got a query tool working, maybe you pray that you're going to get some reports out. But it's going to be very, very difficult, and you're going to have a lot of wasted data. So our approach on our projects is to think in reverse. We look at, what are we trying to get out? Are we trying to get a particular report? Are we getting a visualization, statistic, a dashboard, some kind of analytics? And then work backwards from there to what data we need to collect in our LRS statements, and figure out, how are we going to query it? Can we query the LRS for this data? Are we going to need some other way to query the data beyond the capabilities of the LRS? And that is often the case, but we design all of that before we start looking at statements. So once we've figured out what we're trying to get and how we're going to get there, we look at what data do we need to pick up along the way to ensure that the report, visualization, statistic, or dashboard comes out the way that we want it to.
Sure.
So questions you ask yourself at the beginning of this process is, what is the desired outcome? The report, visualization, statistic, as we said before. Do we have query tools that can get us there? What are those query tools? How are we going to approach those query tools? And can we actually get the data required? Does the data that we need for our report visualization exist? Who owns it? Maybe it's some HR data we're going to need, and maybe they're not going to let us have it. We need to answer those questions before starting our project. Also, is it measurable? I believe the great Peter Drucker said, if you can't measure it, it's not, you can't improve it. That's
exactly. So you can't improve something you can't measure.
Can't improve something you can't measure. I believe that's his exact quote. Thank you. And then, so what is our vocabulary at this point? If we're starting our working backwards, what verbs are we going to use? What objects are we going to use? What activity types, context, and so on.
So what we'll do is we'll step through a series of examples here. We'll take a little more time with this first one to go through those questions in a little more detail, and then the subsequent examples we'll step through a little more quickly. But in this first example, the request was to start analyzing forum data. So we have these threaded discussion groups. You guys are all familiar with these kind of applications where someone can post a question, other people can respond, you can vote it up, vote it down, pretty standard functionality. So the thing that we wanted to generate is some supervisor visualizations. And the idea was that we wanted to identify who are the people that were interacting with those various topics, right? So how or who's interacting and who's having their responses voted up. So we could try to identify people that are either star performers in a particular area, maybe subject matter experts, but also if there are a lot of questions about a particular topic, like there's a competencies and checklists node here on the screen that is much larger than the assessment process, maybe competencies and checklists or something to check out to see if we need some additional training. The other thing, if you see those tick boxes at the bottom of the screen there, we had a request to make this data less personalized in its focus. So instead of highlighting the individual contributors, here they wanted to be able to combine those different interactions by different areas of the organization. So the production department versus the maintenance department versus administration in this case, as opposed to Richard and Lisa and Brittany all having contributions. So we had to be able to do some filtering and grouping. So inside the visualizations, or when we pull up those visualizations, we want to be able to pick the groups. And that means we need data that's not necessarily inside the LRS for us. But we did have that information in another source that happens to be the learning management system, which is nice because we own that data as well from a learning standpoint. What about vocabulary?
Well, the vocabulary implications we get from that chart that we just looked at. One, we need to have the student identified in a consistent way. If you're not aware, xAPI has, I think, 4 functional inverse identifiers or something crazy name like that. But there are 4 ways to identify a person. We need a consistent way. We don't want it to sometimes use the mailbox and sometimes use the account because it will be difficult to report across different statements if we're not consistent. So we didn't want duplicate students showing up on that chart. It would have just looked kind of silly. So we need some data from the LMS is another thing we found. As Duncan mentioned, we need to filter the data first off by supervisor because these charts were being prepared for supervisors. They can see it inside their dashboard. So we need to know who your supervisor is. And that's not necessarily in the statements. It's certainly not a good place to put the supervisor in the statement. So we need some data that exists outside of the LRS, and that, as Duncan mentioned, is in the LMS. And we also need to know what the department teams or work areas you might be assigned to so that we can do that grouping that was requested to not go down to the individual level, but look at a larger picture of what's going on inside the forums. Another thing we know is that each statement has to identify the topic to which it belongs because there are topics and questions and answers, and the topic being the parent of those things. And we want to be able to roll it back up to the particular topic because that was also a request of the client. For example, Lisa voted up Richard's answer. Well, Richard's answer is one statement, and then Lisa voted up his answer. This is something in xAPI called a statement reference. So Richard's answer is another statement, the first statement that came in. And the object is not necessarily the forum topic. Therefore, we're going to have to put the forum topic somewhere in the statement, like context, for example.
Trying to say, it's I think a great example of building that context inside your series of statements, right? How do they build on one another?
Yeah, how do they relate to each other? So the solution infrastructure was going to be something not the LRS in terms of the query tool. So remember we had the question, can I query this data and get it? Well, we need data from 2 sources in this case. We're going to get data from the LMS and from the LRS, and we need to somehow put them back together so that we can show the picture that was requested. So what we did was we came up with a reporting database. Now, this is something that we use very commonly with xAPI data, again, because the LRSA doesn't necessarily have all the information. There's often external sources, and we'll show several examples of that during this presentation today. And if you put the data together in the reporting database, it's just much easier to query with powerful query tools, such as SQL query language, depending upon what database you want to use. You may have different features. So reporting database tends to make these projects a lot easier when we can combine data from multiple sources in one place.
That's exactly right. So, when you said the question about, where do I, can I get this data? Where do I find this data? In this case, we already have the student data in the LMS, so we don't have a security concern there. The LMS also defines that, the credentials essentially for the supervisor. So I can see my own students and maybe not others. So some different, functional security kind of settings there. Yeah, so in this case, we didn't have any outside data sources. Everything else is either going to be from the LRS or it comes from the LMS. And then the last thing, and one that I always try to keep in mind as I'm working with data, especially student data, is, is there a data privacy concern in this case? And this was one where we really didn't have that kind of significant concern. But if we were publishing something with student names outside of the organization, that would certainly have been a different animal, and something we'd have to at least consider and address.
In this case, the supervisors already had
That's
access to their students' data. So
That's right.
No issue there.
So from there, Art mentioned earlier that we want to, remember the very last block on his graph earlier was the actual data design piece. So we had to find out how we're going to write these statements. And there are a couple different vocabularies that are out there, essentially registries for vocabularies. There's the two big ones would be the ADL, right, who owns the standard, developed the standard, and then Rusticy Software also has a pretty extensive library. There's some additional ones out there. So one of the things we had to do was go out and find what verbs we were going to use. So, voted up and voted down were things that we had to locate and have them referenced, because in xAPI, anytime you use a verb, it has to have some kind of definition associated with it, because you can have the same verb used in two very different contexts. So we looked at vocabularies and then tried to find profiles. So a profile is really the recipe for how to use xAPI in a specific use case. So as an example, there's a profile for playing video, right? So that everyone uses the same verbs for advancing a video or reversing a video versus everyone making up their own terms and making it impossible then to really report on. At this point, there was not a profile for forums out in the wild, so we ended up fixing that as well and publishing that profile once we went through and had it kind of finalized and vetted through communities of practice. So one thing that's been impressive in my mind on xAPI, having worked on it for quite a while now, is that everyone tends to work very well together. And now both the ADL and even the IEEE are looking at some standardization and testing for to ensure valid statements. They've already done this with learning record stores, so you can have your learning record store certified by the ADL as compliant. But until we have the way to test those different profiles, a lot of what we did was just passing things around with other colleagues and saying, hey, would you do this? Is there a better way? So if you're having a struggle with finding that pattern, that profile, that recipe, sometimes you have to pull in people from the industry. And there are a number of groups out on the ADL website that have working groups that are developing these standards now, these practices now. So Art has been a member of a community of practice now for, 8 or 9 years that is focused on using xAPI in the use case of launching content from an LMS called CMI5. So once we have our information defined there, we want to start documenting that. One of the things that from a data design standpoint in xAPI, you really don't want to be particularly creative in the developing of your statements. If you can make them consistent with other people's statements, then you have that much greater opportunity for reporting later. So, yeah,
this is an area where sharing is really valuable. So your vocabulary questions again, is there something in the registry that you can use? Is there something, a verb you can use, an activity type that you can use? So you go through the vocabularies and you look at, does this definition match what I'm doing in this case? So for example, there's a launched verb. There's actually two. Launched a rocket versus launched content are two entirely different things. So you got to verify that the definition of the verb you're choosing with its unique IRI matches what you're looking to store data about. Also, as Duncan mentioned, communities of practice are out there. And if you're doing something like video, there's a video profile and you should follow it so that others that write to your LRS also follow that profile. Then you can report across all the videos watched instead of, if you create your own verbs for this, you can't report with anybody else's data. And we still see this a lot.
Yep.
We just were on a project where every single verb had been created from scratch. And we couldn't report on that data versus any other data we already had in our LRS without writing queries and say if it's this verb or this verb or this verb. And it's just a mess. So don't create vocabulary if you don't have to. Every time we've probably created 2 or 3, but we've been working in the industry since 2012 and there weren't vocabularies, but for the most part, we do our best to avoid it. If you do create one, we recommend that you document it very thoroughly and probably share it with ADL and see if maybe they can put it in their vocabulary if they agree upon your definition, agree upon your usage. If you look through the ADL vocabulary, for example, you'll find the risk name on several verbs because ADL basically accepted them. And some of them are the things we use in the forms.
Let's say exactly those form ideas where they just didn't exist prior.
Yeah. So when all else fails, if you can't find anything in the vocabulary that exactly matches, I would check with any industry groups you might be in and see if somebody else has done this, and maybe you can do it with a consistency among your industry. For example, the medical profile, can't remember the name of it, but there's a profile for medical statements. Ubiquitous. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. It was developed by an industry group. The medical industry developed their own vocabulary, and it's now out and available for others to use. Maybe peers in your industry have done something. Maybe somebody in your company has done something. For example, if they've written statements, you probably want to use the same way of identifying the actor that they do, so you have consistent reporting among departments. And peers in your department, same concept. If they've already developed something that you can use and piggyback on, that's a great way to go.
Now, Art mentioned the actor there, right? So you think about your xAPI statement, you've got an actor, a verb, and then the object, whatever they're performing that verb on. And mentioned earlier, there are 4 different methods for identifying agents. It is best if we have the opportunity to pick one and stick with it. Now, sometimes you can. We'll talk about some of those cases. So one of the challenges with using the agent as an actor is, where do we get the the ID that belongs to that person? So that account, can we access that? Well, if we're bringing someone in, say, to a course or a simulation or something where they have to log in using that account, or we could steal that data from the LMS, that tends to be a good, easy way to get there. But if I have something that's purely, say, a mobile application, maybe the only method that I have for identifying that person is something like their mailbox. Now, the downside there is a lot of people have more than one mailbox. And in some organizations, mailboxes get reused when people leave, and in others, they may have group mailboxes. I work with a lot of people that are on, say, a 14-14 rotation or 28-day rotation. So they will have a mailbox that's operations team 1, and whoever is on for that 28 days is the one that checks that mailbox while his or her colleague is back off site. So again, something to at least consider there is how we're going to put this data back together again. And so if I'm using 2 different ways of identifying the same person. There's also the ability to have a group that is your actor. So they can be an anonymous group. So all we're doing is listing out that there were people that are associated. And then there is also a fully identified group where I'm going to have the ID of each person, the name of each person in that group. So depending on the data that I want to collect, it may be valuable for me to just have that anonymous data. Other times I'll need to be able to drill down. There's still the issue of, can I identify these people? Is there a way to get the individual agent information? And then when I'm writing statements, do I send one of those for the group, or do I send one statement per agent? Right? Because I realistically, for that matter, I could do both. One example of anonymous groups that comes to mind is worked with a group up in Michigan that is a children's hands-on museum. So they don't, from a data privacy standpoint, they've got minors that are coming through. They certainly aren't collecting any personal information, but as people move through the museum, it does, and they work on iPads and things to look at different exhibits. It does track at a class level as an anonymous group the topics that were reviewed by each of those students, so they can tie those back to the state objectives for the grade. So great use for an anonymous group, just don't need the personal data there.
Okay, so we've covered actor, we've covered verbs and vocabulary, and then we have some object questions. What type of object am I going to need? What's the activity type for that object? Is the statement going to refer to another object? We talked about being able to vote up or vote down a person's answer, or actually the moderator can also mark those answers as correct. So what kind of activities are we going to use there for the object? And we also, again, looking for that consistent vocabulary to be defined and defined up front before we start writing a bunch of statements. So in our case, this is the rules that we came up with. The actor will be an account using the LMS ID. The reason that we did this, and we do this on most projects, is for consistency. CMI5, as Duncan mentioned, the profile for LMS and LRS working together, does use the LMS identifier as the account. So we're consistent with that. Also, remember that we're going to be putting LMS data and LRS data back together again in the reporting database. So that's a lot easier if we have a common identifier between the two. The verbs we plucked out of the ADL and Rustici registries. I believe those are mostly combined now. I'm not 100% positive. So I would always first start with the ADL. The object IDs are going to include a key of the associated LMS data, again, so that we can easily put data back together. So the form is actually presented by the LMS, and then it writes information to the LRS. So we have that key when we're sending the statement, so we may as well put it into the statement to make our lives easier down the road. The context activities, again, the parent will be the form topic object. Remember, we need to be able to roll data up by topic, and when you have statement references, you can't put that into the object itself. The group includes a reference to the originally posted question, so we can go all the way back in the form topic and see who posted the first question, what questions were being answered, so that we can, again, roll that data up, point to specific questions. And on the chart, remember, we had area topics that were larger, had more contributions. So this helps us get that chart developed. And we have class forums and open forums. And the group includes a reference to the specific course that people are asking questions about. If it's a course, we also have open forums, in which case that doesn't really apply. They're just open questions.
So after we've built these rules, then it's time to document. Don't worry, I have this as a Word template, and it's attached. We can get it with the slide deck when Ann posts that later. But well, actually, I think there's a version of this form out on the ADL website as well, where you can go through and start identifying how you're going to use each of the pieces in your profile. So what is that actor going to be? What's the verb going to be? What's the object? What are the results? So once you have that, it's a matter of then putting it all together. Now, I know that you can't read any of that, but again, we do have reference links in, so you can see all of these statements. You can just trust us too that says that the agent is what Lisa Boss there in the top corner, and she responded.
I can't even read that.
No, there's not.
I'm too old to be able to read that.
It's impossible. So again, once you have that stuff documented, we get it out there, and Art and I were talking about it one time. We probably spend a half day designing what a statement should look like for the 5 minutes of actually coding anything there. So it's much, we take the burden in on the design side, and then putting something out is much easier. So I told you we were going to beat up that example pretty severely. We're going to hit these additional examples a little bit more lightly, but I want to use those forms because everybody, I feel like, understands that process very well for a jumping off point. The second request that we had, and this was from a client, and they wanted to be able to identify competency gaps in their training, and people that were passing particular courses but may have missed out on mastery of a particular objective. And they also wanted to tie that in with some safety data. So before I move off of this graphic, a couple things. We have up at the top, just some measures for the administrators and supervisors of the group, a fit checklist that were completed, competency assessments, questions that are passed and failed. But then this data down below is safety data coming in from another source that's not xAPI. So we'll talk about how we get there. One of the other things that we'll take a look at is getting into the actual passed and failed objectives themselves, because if you notice on this screenshot, you have objectives like aerial lift and colorimetric tubes and the hazards of steam. And then there's this one great big bar at the top that says unknown. Well, that unknown tab or unknown bar is SCORM data, because their existing SCORM data did not have objectives, even though technically could be done. So what's the need?
There are objectives in SCORM.
There are objectives in SCORM, but
they're not really tied
no,
to learning objects in most cases. I've never seen that.
Yeah.
So the example here is obviously a petrochemical company based on the kinds of objectives you see. They're interested in the mastery of objectives versus passing courses. Passing courses doesn't mean you're necessarily capable to go out and be safe. The ability to drill down to the question level and find out how those questions match up with objectives, which objectives are being missed, why are they being missed, and the supervisor has access to these reports, but they're limited to their direct reports. So again, that's not data that's going to be in the LRS statement. So we're going to have to put some data together once again.
So their current state, they had a ton of SCORM content with embedded tests. That things set at 70% to pass. Pretty limited in the ability to do item analysis, on that SCORM content. And again, like I mentioned, there was no tie back to the learning objective. So we start thinking about how do we design something? What are our sources? Well, the learning content we'll have to do some modification to so that we can track that, the objectives for each question. And we did that by adding xAPI to each of those questions. Then the visualizations, what are we going to do to tell this story? What does someone need to see and how do they need to be presented? And finally, what's the intervention piece? So what are we going to do when there's a problem? And so it's not mastering the objective, because the content has to accurately gauge mastery. And of course, we came back in and made a review, bringing in subject matter experts and instructional designers to take a look at that content. There were certainly objectives that weren't being assessed at all. And then objectives that may not have been effectively assessed or accurately. So there was a lot of work that had to come in to update the content that they had, in addition to just building a dashboard, because they didn't have that data.
So once again, we're back to our solution using a reporting database. It just seems to work a lot. But we also had to get data from external sources that was in a feed that we really didn't need to put into the reporting database. So we got the data from the LRS into the reporting database. We once again had the need to filter by supervisor, and then also those reports roll up by department, so that a department manager can get an overall view of what's going on with relationship to this data. And then we had external systems that were collecting all the data, and we wanted to do data collecting the observations, the safety observations, the safety incident reporting database. And then we needed to create those visualizations that you saw. The solution for those visualizations was Power BI, Microsoft BI reporting tool. And the great thing about it is it can hook up to all of these systems. It can read an Excel file. We actually fed the data from the reporting database, got fed into Power BI via a direct query, because Power BI can read directly from SQL Server. So that's where we put the reporting database. The external systems, I believe the data was brought in with spreadsheets that, using Microsoft Flow, they get updated all the time coming out of these other systems. And then since we've got all the data in Power BI, we can make all of these visualizations. So we had all these different systems that had to be shown on the same dashboard. And using Power BI plus our reporting database turned out to be the way to get it done.
Well, and part of that was driven by the client themselves, because they were already using Power BI in-house. They had the expertise there.
Yeah.
They really...
Our client was a lot better at Power BI than we were.
They just needed a little guidance in where what the data looked like, more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the keys to this project was pulling the tests out of this form content and putting in something that was capable of linking them to objectives. So the results, they were able to identify content and assessment gaps. So there were some problems with the content not necessarily addressing the objectives that they thought it was addressing. Same thing with the test questions. One particular area, they found quite a few bad test questions that had to be redeveloped. They were able to identify competency gaps easier because of the better assessment and tying back to objectives. They also brought in SME intervention. Subject matter experts came in when people failed. So there was mentoring or coaching response. Now that they knew which objectives were not being met, they could bring somebody in to help the student improve. And they improved their communication, because these Power BI reports, they're running on a weekly basis. And every Monday morning, these arrive in the mailbox of the supervisors from the department head. So that begins to focus your attention when management can actually see what's going on in the learning environment. And this is an actual quote from someone in the C-suite, came down to L&D and said, as we focus more and more on analytics, it makes sense to delve into what our learning data can tell us. So this was the proverbial seat at the table that L&D is always looking for. If you have the data, you'll get respect in this case.
This is always the happy dance kind of piece, where you can start moving learning into the business line, right? And see the value there. So we've got another example here, and this is the one where I told you we had a little bit of an oversight in coming in and defining how we're going to do this project.
This is the cautionary tale.
This is a cautionary tale, but we can't hide those either. So I'm almost embarrassed to tell you about the process on this one, but we have a group that worked with that had a ton of PDF documents, and they were having some control issues there. So they wanted to document how people are using those PDFs and being able to do some analysis, what pages are being accessed, what pages are being have notations on them, highlights, underlines. Someone's actually written notes. There's kind of a sticky note function there, and then at a high level view, being able to take a look down those, in this case, slides, and see what pages have different types of edits on those. We'll come back to that one. So their goal really was to evaluate usage, how people are interacting with that training material. But there are a couple other things going on. One, they want to know if that content's still valid. Where do questions come up? Because these are documents that are being used largely in instructor-led courses, or they were at that time. So if an instructor said, yes, you have an instruction or a work process that says, open this valve, and the instructor says, hey, make sure when you do it, you open it very slowly, and everybody writes that down. It's pretty easy to see in the reporting later that maybe we should change the wording to open that valve slowly, or open it one spoke at a time, or whatever the magic thing is. So how do you know where questions are? Are there opportunities of streamline training that pieces that people don't use, that we don't need to spend time investing in? So their current state of training, this is a heavily regulated environment. They have this huge amount of archived material, because realistically, what I first thought was, gosh, let's convert these to ebooks, but they said, no, this is way more content than we want to start working with there. They had gone through an evolution. They had started out, in the old days of 3-ring binders that got shipped out. Then they went to giving everybody content on a USB drive, but there was a concern, of course, with security there, and having documents that are loose on the wild. So they needed to have some kind of document control and allow these students to mark up those guys. So
before the word profile was adopted, we came up with a recipe, because that's kind of what profiles used to be called. And we had to come up with a profile or recipe for what we were doing with this particular set of statements in the PDF documents. Now, since then, we've gone back, and a lot of this now is in the xAPI vocabulary, so you can find what we had to really create from scratch at the time, because there just wasn't anything that tracked annotations and documents. So we had to start from the beginning. The solution that we came up with for this client was the xAPI enabled PDF reader. And then it has a layer on top of it where you can draw your markups, you can add your annotations, and then all of those annotations are stored in the LRS. One of the reasons that we had to do it this way is the client required PDFs, so we could not talk them out of it. And second, the customers that are viewing the documents are being trained by an organization, and these are the member companies, and then they send their students to learn this stuff, and then they need to have access to it again when they get back to their desk. But they're not allowed to take documents with them. So we use the LMS to control accessing to the documents. And you can't, some of the documents you can download and print, they specify when they put it in, whether that's possible. If they don't have that ability, if they don't have access to that document other than through the application, they're not allowed to download. So we had to hide the location of the PDFs. So the viewer reads the document in and then displays it, but it's all in memory on the computer, and they can't really download the PDF itself. So the annotations are stored in the cloud so that they can pull it up again when they get back to their desktop and see the notes that they made and the highlights they made. And then we have the reporting of all those annotations from the LRS.
Now, we had most of the reporting. This last piece, this idea of having thumbnails where I can look quickly at a glance through documents to see what pages have edits, requires us to have a document path, right? So we needed to know where that document lives so we could go back and pull that document up and the associated statements. That's not something that we had included in the xAPI statements originally, because we were launching those. We were launching those documents from the LMS. We already knew that where those things were. It wasn't a critical piece of the xAPI statement until we look back here and said, "Oh gosh!" So we have to have a path. We need to make a change. How do we do that? Well, we had about 300,000 statements in the LRS at that time. Because xAPI is immutable, we had to void those 300,000 statements and issue another 300,000 statements to fix them. That were updated statements. So I'm glad to find it earlier than sooner rather than later, but it shows that, gosh, even though you pre-planned, there are going to be times you may have an oversight there, and we've got to go back and find a little more data.
Yeah, we forgot about the thumbnails. Was the real mistake that we made. And in order to get the thumbnails, we had to be able to get the document. We get to this visualization mode.
Oh, oops, that doesn't work. So some key takeaways here. How are you going to use the data that you're collecting as reports, or statistics, visualizations, analytics? Maybe it's something completely different. Maybe you've got an application that takes a bit of the data that you're collecting in xAPI and does something else with it, like assign someone a subsequent training module based on their completion, or it has some kind of adaptive content that can go through. I've got 2 children that are in the driver's ed phase of life right now, and I would sure love for my car to give me a report card on how they do. And I always think this is a great xAPI opportunity that hasn't been capitalized on. So what am I going to do with this data? How am I going to get it? What's my source? Will I be able to query that and find the information that I need? If there's a chance to use established libraries of vocabularies and profiles, then certainly do that. It helps stay consistent and will improve reporting. You do have to think about actors, right? Because again, if you want to use a mailbox versus an actual account number, where am I going to get that information? What's it going to do to me if I have 2 different data sources and they use different identifiers? How am I going to rectify that? So are my objects defined and named? And then from a context standpoint, how am I going to group those different statements if they are in fact related to one another? So in the forum world, you have that initial forum post that's a parent of all of the responses there. But then a response could be to one of the earlier comments. So in that case, then the statement is, the object is that other statement. So how are you going to build that? And the same is very true in online content, where you might say that you have a test question that has a parent that is a course, and even go up to another level and say that course may have a parent that's a curriculum. So how am I going to group those pieces of information and then document? That's really the key. Is document and be faithful to that governance. Those things are going to evolve over time, but having that foundation laid is what's going to allow you to generate quality xAPI because you've really started looking at designing by that end case. I know the destination of my journey, and that's what I'm backing up and working towards. So,
and the last thing we've got for you today is references. We've talked about the vocabularies and the Rusty registry. We also mentioned the communities of practice that are available on ADL's website, some information about them. And then, as we promised, there's the reference to the article we have on how we did forums, and everything won't be in small type, so you'll be able to see it in the article.
And again, if you do want to get a hold of us or have any questions, by all means, reach out. We are easy to find. I was going to ask Ann if we had any questions in the chat that came through while we were rattling along there.
I do not see any questions at the moment, and I didn't see any as you guys were doing the presentation. But I'm sure once people get a chance to review everything, there may be additional questions. So we'll just hang for a second here in case anyone has any questions. Great presentation as always.
Thank you very much. I know that we pushed right up until the end time there, so may have lost some comments as well.
Absolutely.
So,
like as I mentioned, it seemed like many of the attendees were global and intended to get the recording since it's probably midnight where they are. And as much as I like you guys,
We're not that captivating.
I'm not staying up till midnight to watch the session. So, well, thank you to everyone who attended live, and for everyone who's watching the replay. We would welcome any feedback or comments. As Duncan mentioned, they're easy to reach and contact Art and Duncan both. So feel free to reach out for any questions or any follow-up to anything that was shared today. We do have an entire series of these webinars, which are shared on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and week or evening, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.